So here we are live. I guess somebody in the live chat can let us know if we're actually live because I have limited ways to tell here without dialing in myself. I think we are. Okay. We were, yeah, so you posted something in the Discord, Seraphim?
Yeah, relevant to our discussion today because, this is a really big topic. And I think if we want to kind of just narrow our focus, the heading for that list was what is most relevant about religion or religious ideas for each quality of consciousness and spiral dynamics. So I
Yeah,
really
so
like the way you sort of have a scheme of what I call neo-dispensationalism, which is
ah,
basically, lining up the spiral to
yeah,
sacred history, right?
I like that neologism there, the
Yeah.
neo-dispensationalism. So I want to, since we just started going live, Roberta says we're live, so we're safe now. We're safe for now. Thank God we're in a bowling alley. Okay.
We're actually super unsafe now, but that's okay.
So I want to give out a disclaimer because when you're a Christian channel, when people speak, a lot of listeners think that they are hearing someone teach things that people are expected to believe is truth. That's not what we're doing today. That's not what we're ever doing. Our presumption today, we're looking at growth models and we're trying to visualize some growth concepts. And my presumption is that all models are wrong and some are useful. That's it. And so with that presumption, we've been talking about and looking at various different growth models. And we think that some of them are useful, but we're not presenting any of them as dogmatic truth that anyone is expected to believe. So what thread did you post that in the general and the links and resources?
Yeah, that's in general. I'm looking at it. It's about, I'd say, 20 posts up in the general,
When you post up.
but they're still going, so it might be higher.
Yeah.
But no, okay, it's just two posts down from your post about this particular meeting. So yeah, it's
Oh,
right under that.
okay. I'm looking for that right now. It might help if you could, I don't know if you could email me or text it to me real quick because
Or I
I'm
could share
scrolling
screen.
up and it's okay. What is most relevant about that? Let me look.
Yep.
Okay. I got it on my
It,
phone. I don't have it on my Discord desktop right now. What I could do is I could stick that in a slide and show it.
what is most relevant about religion for each quality of consciousness and spiral dynamics?
And so you got magical, domination, order, authoritarian, achievement, competitive, community, ecological. Yeah. So that's coming up. So share my screen real quick. We were talking about Wednesday night. This conversation stems from a conversation that we had Wednesday night. And Wednesday night, we were talking about lateral moves, how you can make a vertical move or a lateral move. And so going from, say, Calvinism to provisionism would be a lateral move, not a vertical move. Okay. And you might increase the amount of data included in a lateral move, but you haven't increased capacities or anything else. And someone else said, well, someone might go and make a vertical move prematurely. And I pushed back on that with the idea that I don't think people can go vertically until they can go vertically. I think you can virtue signal that you have. I think you can adopt ideology from what higher level consciousness people say, but you would be bringing it into probably a whatever level of consciousness you're at. So a second grader couldn't probably do advanced calculus or astrophysics, but they might be able to listen to a calculus professor and repeat back 15 minutes of a lecture with good fidelity if they memorized it. But that doesn't mean that they actually have that level of consciousness. It's two different kinds of things. Does that make sense? So that's kind of where we were. And then to share my screen, what we've been operating off of
Well,
is
it's like the way a blind person could hear the way sighted people describe a sunset and then parrot that back.
right. Recite it back to you. Or maybe even hear the way 15 sighted people describe the same sunset and then combine, give you elements of all 15 of those to make it
Right.
sound unique. Kind of like
Right.
what GPT does.
Exactly. Right.
It's actually a really good point. So virtue signaling is like a low level, mediocre large language model
Exactly. That's awesome.
of zero consciousness.
Mm. Mm.
So the neo-dispensationalism.
So something I'm hearing actually implicit in what you guys just said was that like Chat GPT would be able to make horizontal moves across the patterns and recognize patterns, but it's not able to make these vertical jumps to see like a higher level of meaning or significance or something like that, or connection between the things. And then Kevin, what you said was something about, well, it's like a higher level of, or zero level consciousness.
Mhm.
So what that implies is that under our model, the actual ability to make a vertical is distinctive of consciousness.
Yes.
If the entity doesn't have the ability to make a vertical, then it is not a conscious being.
Right,
So
exactly.
it just kind of answers the AI, or like that's a little bit of a like 2 cents into the little AI pot or whatever. Oh, is AI, conscious or something like that? If it
So,
can't make a vertical move, then I would say no.
I mean, I think there's even a more profound question that's answered in this is that what we've done with humans in our typical education models is we've made ourselves into mediocre AIs. So you send somebody to school and they aggregate a whole bunch of data that they can repeat back with fidelity and maybe even do a job well that still pumps back into the same kind of society to pump back into the same kind of aggregation of information.
Mm,
Um, you've when you do that, when you're aggregating, when you're a data aggregation mechanism as a human, you are no longer increasing in consciousness. You're
right.
increasing in the amount of quantity that you as a mediocre machine can do.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is that actually at first tier, I mean, I'm kind of a spiral dynamics radical. So to me, at first tier, as long as you're pretty entrenched in first tier, you are just basically a large language model. You might have an inkling of what it means to be aware at the non-dual consciousness level of second tier, which is, non-dual consciousness is the primary signifying feature of second tier. But that awareness is going to be basically dormant or latent until such a time as it's effectuated after you cross over that barrier into second tier. So, I mean, all of first tier is predominantly an LLM.
Yeah, I want to show just so people can kind of follow along. Um,
Yeah. So could I, before we continue on with how this came about and what we're about to do, could I just say this? I just want to reiterate that yes, we did this did pop in some ways out of nowhere during our FSI session on Wednesday night. And the group found it to be lucrative and profitable. And so we kind of felt like we would try and take a stab at
not in a
playing at it
monetized.
again. And so again, I just want to reiterate what Kevin said before. What we're about to do on the video here is literally just come together and try and see if we can forge out together something a little bit more refined or clear about this thing that we were seeing. We're just kind of we just kind of have a play date in a sense.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
really all it is. We're not here trying to on a Sunday afternoon preach to you the this new doctrine that we've discovered that everybody should be adhering to and everybody should think. It's kind of just an opportunity for the audience to observe and participate in the construction or playful playful musings of what we're trying to see, and then to use whatever comes out of it as a model that may be useful. It's not correct, it's not all encompassing, it's not right, but it may be useful to you during the week,
It may give the authentic self enough to grasp onto, to open its eyes a little more and stop hitting the snooze button. So I'm going to share the screen to kind of show, which one am I looking at? Oh, we want to do this one. Some of the assumptions that we've been operating with. And what we've done before is we take a basic timeline of the Bible, and it doesn't matter what the timeline is or what the time scales are. If you don't like my timeline, you can make your own. It's fine. You can make it as long as you want, as short as you want. That's not the point. And then you take growth models. In this case, we're using the spiral dynamic, which also Ken Wilber, when he was making integral theory, heavily relies on this, even though he also displays over 100 growth models in the back of his books. And also we discard all the specific peculiarities of the growth model, but then we superimpose them. And you can ask the question at each, if you understand what each level of consciousness is, then you can kind of understand where we are in society today and what we have. So, and also when a scriptural speaker is speaking at a particular time, you could understand what kind of audience they are talking to. So this would actually be, if you're looking at society itself, our current society, probably shouldn't move that around too much. Our current society is mostly like blue, orange, green. Our current society is, but we still have a lot of this going on in various different reasons for various different. And then we have a few. We have a small percentage of our population that is in second tier consciousness. So this timeline is a little off because of that. But you could look back in the Bible timelines and you could say, well, when Solomon is writing the book of Ecclesiastes, he's writing from the perspective of someone who is under the sun. In other words, he's not claiming any supernatural revelation into divine metaphysics. He's talking about what he's observed under the sun, and he's probably in some kind of, blue, half purple, red, kind of half purple perspective and audience that he's coming from. And maybe he himself had a higher level of, maybe he's second tier consciousness himself, but his audience definitely is not. So he's writing things down to this level. And of course,
Kevin, can I just interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah.
Because you never operate at one level all the time, 24/7. We operate at different levels throughout the day.
Mm-hmm.
So we are actually, if we were to say this is my level, it's only what's preponderant throughout the day. Let's say I operate 80% of the time at red, or 80% of the time green, but at other times and at other moments it's situational. So there could have been utterances by Solomon which were turquoise, but he himself might have operated on a daily basis as the king in red or blue.
Right.
That's a great point.
Yeah. So to just to get this out of the way, because I want to keep this discussion going without disrupting the flow, we were talking about lateral moves going back and forth. And then the idea is that at the lower levels of consciousness, there's all kinds of lateral moves you can make. If you're beige, you can get food and whatever you need from anywhere. If you're purple, there are thousands of tribes you can join, perhaps, or thousands of tribes that are out there. If you're red, you can make all these lateral moves. If you're blue, there's all kinds of different denominations that you can go church hopping from. 30,000 different Christian denominations you can hop around on. But the idea is that as you go a little higher and higher, the fewer lateralizations there are to consider, which would make it look kind of like a pyramid. Mm-hmm. So we went with a pyramid the idea is that as you go in higher levels of consciousness, there are fewer lateralizations you can make. And that gives us the shape of a pyramid that's what your lateralization options would look like as you increase in consciousness. But if you superimpose this with the spiral dynamic growth model, you are expanding in things like awareness. Consciousness is the real thing, but along with that, you're getting awareness, charity, empathy, perspectival capacity, agency, locus of authority is internalized. Down here, I added attachments and ego. At the bottom, they are as wide as your attachments and your ego are as wide as the base of the pyramid, and those narrow as you go up. So the more expanded your consciousness becomes, the narrower your ego and ego attachments are.
Yeah.
So then the final thing I did was re-stick the timeline back onto there to give people an idea of what this really looks like.
Yeah, I think we also pointed out two other things with that diagram there, or with that chart, which one of them was we had brought out that for those of us that are familiar with Ruckman's work, that I believe Ruckman sees New Jerusalem in Revelation as in the shape of a pyramid, which we were taking to imply that the shape, or at least the structure that we were seeing here could nicely overlay into a biblical narrative.
Yeah,
or
like where does this pyramid idea come from? Ruckman sees the shape of the universe as a pyramid, and we're not necessarily saying that's the case, but why is this?
Right.
When Jesus's garment was like a one-piece seamless thing, something we would probably call like a poncho, and notice at the top of the pyramid you usually have an opening with something missing, and like on the dollar bill, that top part is removed and there's an eye in it and it can see. So there's a vision up there, and then there's a hole, kind of like a poncho, can be taken off and it would be draped over the universe. And then comes a time in the book of Hebrews when God is going to remove this garment. And not trying to be rude or crude, but God will be unveiled or naked, you might say. And then interestingly, there's this fascination. If you look in Clarence Larkin's Dispensational Truth, he has a whole section on the pyramids. There's this fascination with. So it seems like maybe whoever built the pyramids was onto something. And I know that all the different theories that are out there, the electricity ones being the most interesting to me, but who knows? Everything's fractal. How many different meanings this has.
And then the second thing that we came out with was that the shape of a pyramid was helpful to us in terms of our thinking, because it turns out that when the Greek philosophers in the axial age are starting to develop like a more formalized, or at least like playful or economical way of dialogue. So like you're dialoguing with people not merely for the sake of just bare bones like survival communication. You're starting to dialogue with people for higher social reasons, like the construction of what a good person or a just person might look like, and therefore a just city, what that might look like. So the form of dialogue starts to take this more social economical utility to it. And that these Greek philosophers, what they start doing is they start off with like Pythagoras and stuff like that with geometry. They're very familiar with the the theorems. They start developing all that, and then when they cross over and start developing this style of dialogue, which is meant to be enriching and to provoke and instill some kind of growth in the individuals, they start using geometric principles and geometric shapes in order to like make analogies on what the form of the thing that they're talking about might look like. So it's very normal for somebody who's engaged in what I'll call productive dialogue to use a shape or geometric shape in order to start with like a skeletal form of just what they're trying, the concept they're trying to get across. And we did that with a triangle. And that we said that's actually a very useful thing to do when you're even thinking with yourself, is to start thinking in a basic shape. And is what I'm seeing, or is the concept I'm trying to, or the social phenomenon that I'm trying to understand, is it in the shape of a circle, like bare bones? So that would imply some kind of like reciprocity. There is no beginning or end, something like that. It's a perpetual kind of thing. You can start using that understanding to even enhance the thought horsepower that you have. So we noticed that we were doing that on Wednesday night.
Yeah, and it all erupted spontaneously and kind of came out of nowhere, which is one of the beautiful things about our FSI group, is those kinds of things happen where you couldn't really plan for them, but then everybody walks away with a little more insight than what they had before, or a little different way to look at it than you had thought of before.
So I guess I have a question then. So one of the things that we noticed with the spiral dynamic was, I think somebody had brought up that in modern time, it felt like the pace at which technology is pushing society along is as if like the changes in our environment, in our ecosystem, are happening at such a rate that is hard, or at least more difficult to keep up with than it would have been, say, 400 or 500 years ago. So, for example, I think the example we used was that a person in 1400 may have seen basically the same technology for agriculture, say, for their entire lifetime. Where for us, I'm born in 1989, so I have, the agricultural changes that I will have experienced or seen in the lifetime back in 1400, I will have seen in the span of like maybe 10 years. So, like the rate at which people are being expected or required to keep up with the sheer force of technology and environmental change is increasing rapidly, which is which is going in the opposite direction of the spiral dynamic in terms of human consciousness. Human consciousness in the spiral dynamic theory is actually starting at more of a singular point and then starts to spiral and expand, where the environment that we're in is starting to, it may be spiral, but it's starting to decrease, or taper down into a singularity. I think Kevin had mentioned. Is everybody tracking with that?
Yeah, I posted a picture up here. Everything in this picture is now in your pocket when it comes to what all has changed just in our lifetimes. The way we would talk to each other, film things, listen to music. I mean, the fact that we listen to recorded music in the first place is a drastic change to how it was ever heard before. Like music was always a dialogue in the past. There was always a performer and an audience, and there was never this stale thing where it is a static other that you can just listen to and it's the same every time. Music was never that way. It was always bespoke to how it was where it was performed. So the singularity would be like in a period of so many years, there would be so much drastic change in the technology of society that it would be unrecognizable within just a few years, like a 5-year time span from now till that point. Would that future would be just as unrecognizable to us as bringing somebody from 1370 into today, or even more so.
Right.
More so.
So my question is kind of, what do you guys think about the implications of that mental diagram that we have, where the environment that we're in is spiraling down and which means that there's less distance the further you get along, also implying that there's less time. So things happen more rapidly, which is what we're observing. But if you flip the spiral around into the consciousness model, things start, the space increases, which means that time also increases. So what do you guys think that, like, so if you get those two spirals to interact, let's call one the spiral of environment and the other the spiral of consciousness in the individual, how do you think that those interact? Is kind of like, what are the implications of their interaction? Does that make sense? Like, what's between, what does that mean between them?
Like every organism is basically a microcosm of its environment. So if you were to take a bird, you could deduct the basic air pressure that it was flying through, what it breathed, what it needed. You could scientifically examine a bird, its aerodynamic, everything from its aerodynamics to its whatever's flowing through its bloodstream, and you could determine what kind of environment that it lived in. Well, we are niche creators, and it seems like we're probably going to be pushed to the limit of how much niche creation we can do and how much we can adapt to when the niche creation itself is no longer a human product but becomes a machine product.
Okay.
Because right now we are the niche creators. We are building buildings, we are building and designing cars, and we're using machines to help us do things. And just within the past year, just about every company that's out there, including the one that I work for, has told all of its employees, you better learn how to integrate AI into what you're doing to help make what you're doing more productive. And it's just a matter of time before we don't need people to do that anymore. And eventually AI will probably be able to do 95% of all of our beige needs.
So what does that imply for the growth or expansion of our, quote, consciousness under the spiral dynamics model? What does that imply? That's kind of what my question is.
So you want a SWOT analysis, I guess. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't know. That's
I would add with that question, I guess, is do we see a point to where that threat that you're talking about, Kevin, could create a crash?
Yeah, that would be among the, if you're doing a risk analysis, what is the black swan, which by definition is what you don't see coming.
Exactly.
So what are the strengths? What are the strengths would be something like, or what are our strengths? We are niche creators and we are adaptable as humans. We can be hunter gatherers. We can be Eskimos. We can be tribesmen in Africa or in North America, and we can be we can run nuclear power plants. We're very adaptable. That would be humanity's strength. Weaknesses, we're very egoic, and you'd probably put vulnerabilities into weaknesses, and it would be the rate of adaptability. We don't know what that is. Opportunities, if you look at what we're doing right now, we have people, like you're in the Midwest somewhere, James. We're from Louisiana, California, Connecticut, in the Midwest, and we're having a conversation like we're sitting in the same room. That's an opportunity. How many more opportunities will advanced technology bring to us that are like that?
Hmm.
And then threats. Yeah. Threat, a weakness is a weakness that we have. A threat is something that the situation or the environment contains or offers within itself. So how would it threaten whatever it is we're trying to do, which would beg the question, what is it we're trying to do? I think what we're trying to do is this. Whatever this society is, like our society, let's basically call it orange right now. We basically have an orange society with its trending green. What that means is that adults who reach maturity in this society will be orange trending green. That's what that means. The question is, how do we build a culture that can produce people that have a higher consciousness level than the environment that our planet is enjoying right now? So
Right.
if the entire planet is orange, how do we produce green people? If the entire planet is green, how do we produce yellow people? If your church is blue,
Right.
like I grew up in a very blue church environment, which means it only produces blue adults. And so in other words, so you have to get out of that. You have to, how does the product of the individual you are producing and training, how does it come out higher than what you are?
Right.
Which is not going to easily or without intention.
Well, because we got to think about the necessity of that endeavor, which is something like, what are the consequences if we don't keep pace with the rapidly transforming environment? Like, what are the consequences? You know, I think what's ringing here is like John Vervaeke's little thing about like wisdom since the beginning has always been a necessary thing. It's not optional for you to pursue wisdom. It's something that you do instinctually and out of necessity. You have to. You can't help but at least pursue it, however warped it may be.
So,
that in the pursuit.
like I hear that, and I've heard him say that, but I know of a lot of people who do not care about pursuing wisdom. They really don't. And it's anything from like dogmatic religious people to people who are like, I'm comfortable. I've got a good job. I enjoy my life. That's all I need. You know what I mean? There's a lot of apathy toward the acquisition of wisdom that I observe. So that makes me scratch my head because I don't get that. I can't get that.
Well, especially if you compare that with the lifestyle, if you will, of Solomon, and all the things he pursued through his life, and was considered the wisest man to be. Yet turns around and writes a book about all life's vanities because of his experiences.
Right. And that's what I think the key word to answer Kevin's provocative question is something like the vanity of it. I think that I think John Vervaeke is saying that because in the same way that Jordan Peterson is kind of saying, like, if you don't pursue what's meaningful, then the consequences are hell itself. Like, they are essentially the end of the world as it's known, which is there's nothing that's meaningful, which is utter nihilism, which is vanity. The end is this oblivion of nothingness. So I think that's why Jordan Peterson will kind of encourage this relentless pursuit of that which is meaningful, and John Vervaeke will, in his own language, will say something like, wisdom is not optional, because the opposite is utter nihilism or vanity, which is in some ways exactly in line with what Solomon is saying in his in his writings, basically. Is that if you're not going to pursue this, and it doesn't necessarily need to be explicit, like you don't have to have a PhD in, the pursuit of wisdom in order to pursue wisdom. Yeah, you know what I'm saying? It's sort of more of an implicit thing, I think, in a more fundamental thing than we're really giving it credit for. However, it's really the neglect or the willful negation of that pursuit is an instance of utter vanity and nihilism.
Well, I want to get to Seraphim's hand in a second, but to riff on what you're saying, Nick, one of the problems that I see is that the system, people, where are my props? The people who are following things where they think they get wisdom from, also prone to superstition and magical thinking. Yeah. Like when I pop a slide up here that has the 4 different ways to come to know something, which is different than the 4 different kinds of knowing, or 4E cognition, or different personality traits, the big 5, or multiple intelligences, or salience landscaping, or predictive processing, or what constitutes meaning, or what are the moral foundations. If I pop something up there that has all this stuff on it, it's a lot easier to be like, well, the Holy Spirit just guides me in all these things, and I don't need to know any of that stuff. I don't need to pursue any of that because God is in me guiding me. It's like this. It's technically correct. The proposition's correct, but what they're doing with that proposition is self-destructive and apathetic and nihilistic. They're using it as an excuse, as a crutch to not advance themselves into the higher level of capacity that could help other people avoid unnecessary suffering.
And ultimately, the end result of that is just as what we're saying, is the degeneration of personal agency and meaning in life.
Yeah, I really think that neotenous blue religious thinking is more of a threat than technology. Because the people that I know of that their life is a living hell, it's because of reliance on these kinds of things that didn't get them anywhere, that didn't solve their problems. The marriage didn't work out. The grandkids hate them. Everyone's on drugs. Nobody has any money. That's what's going on. And that's the hell you want to be in. And that's the hell they're all in. Stairfall. Got his hand up.
So, yeah, we need to tease a few things out from what you guys have been saying over the past couple of minutes, because I'm highlighting different aspects and features of the spiral. So just going off of what how John Vervaeke defines wisdom. John Vervaeke speaks of wisdom as being able to see reality as it is through illusion. All right. So if we just kind of stick on this definition for a little bit, to unpack some of the.
You mean like see through the illusion?
Yeah, that's all. I know that's always an ambiguity. Not seeing by means of illusion, seeing past illusion into reality, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so what are some of the things the spiral tells us? And I don't think enough emphasis is really laid on the fact that there are first and second tiers. There is a border there. What is the chief distinction between second and first tier? So, I'm doing a Socratic method here.
Yeah, something jumped out to me today. There seems to be a struggle in green, which is the last tier of first tier consciousness, which is the last stage of first tier consciousness. There seems to be a struggle in green between, like, I have all my values. Now, what do I use to enact those values? Meaningful personal connection or top-down hierarchical authoritarian pressure? Do I cancel people? Do I become an activist and hold a picket sign and change the laws and force people to do it my way? Or do I have an interpersonal connection that out of the relationship blooms a non-rivalrous way of doing things? So, and it seems like all the first tier consciousness stuff, they all think their own way is the right way and every other way is wrong. And so there's all this antagonism and rivalry.
Okay.
Mhm.
How do you boil that down into one word? Boil that down into one word.
Well,
Perspective.
It's egoism.
Yeah.
That's the whole first tier is distinguished by the fact that at every level it's an increase in egoism.
Mhm.
And actually red is kind of often defined as egoistic, but I would contend that you actually get more egoistic as you go up. But anyway, going back to Vervecchi's definition, when Vervecchi speaks of illusion, what is he speaking about? What is the chief illusion? What is the grand illusion?
Oh,
Ego.
It's egoism.
Yeah.
Okay, so if
It's
I put
funny.
those two ideas together,
I've seen every problem that we have, even in psychology, other than the cluster A stuff, can be expressed in terms of egoism and of egoic development, ego transcendence, or otherwise.
So if we put those two ideas together, that this chief distinction between second tier and first tier is that first tier is enmeshed in egoism, and second tier begins to kind of egoism begins to loosen its hold on second tier. I see the chief distinguishing feature of second tier as being altruism, as being the understanding that we're all one, there is no separate self, and that we need to be working together. That's what second tier consciousness is. Okay, so if Vervecchi's right, that wisdom is.
Can I click on that for a second? I want to double click that when you all working together is like a second tier consciousness person is going to be more of a systems thinker. So when you see somebody that's outside of your value structure, you don't see them as someone that needs to be conquered and defeated. You see that as a symptom or an artifact of an overall systemic problem that you need to play a role in helping find the resolution to, so that those kinds of people aren't enculturated anymore. Like if you don't like how Donald Trump operates, well, what is he a product of? And how do we have a society that doesn't produce those kinds of people? That kind of thing. So you're thinking more systemically, and how do we all work together to get to what was best, what is in our best interest?
Yeah, exactly right. And that I would just boil that down into one word as being altruism. Altruism being the understanding that I am not the thing that's important here. What's important is the system as a whole. Altruism is just systems thinking that others meaning the whole of humanity, are more important than me, and that we're all in this together. So anyway, back to Vervecchi.
I hate to keep interrupting you, but going back to meaning in life, altruism, meaning in life, Vervecchi also says you have purpose, coherence, significance, and mattering. And in mattering, you would ask yourself, what do I want to continue even if I'm not around? And then what am I doing that matters to that keeps that going?
And that could connect back to Ian McGilchrist too, and his idea that where we place our attention is really where our being is. So if we find that 90% of our attention is focused on ourselves and our own problems, our own ideas, our own loyalties, our own sense of separation, then that's where we're at. But if 90% of our attention is focused outward to see, what are your problems? What are you going through? How can I help you? How can I help the situation? That's where that attention focus is also at second tier. But if because Nick made the really interesting point, which I agree with, which was that, we're all destined eventually to get to second tier. And this is, I think we have to absolutely, anytime we ever talk about this topic, we have to make the proviso, because whenever first tier people start hearing a bunch of people who assume that they're second tier talking about this, they think it's a dominance hierarchy game. And people at second tier realize the one chief feature of second tier is this is not about dominance hierarchy and superiority. This is about a shift in perspective. So it's like once you understand wisdom, whatever you want to call it, altruism, non-duality, you're already looking you're looking downstream of the whole, I hate to use the word evolution, so let's say the history of consciousness. You're looking downstream at the history of consciousness and agreeing with what Nick says, that, oh yeah, we're actually all headed for wisdom one way or another.
Increasingly adaptive consciousness.
Right. And so all the problems that you guys had been speaking of, like, Kevin, you made the observation that, I don't see people moving toward wisdom. Well, I mean, I would contend that that's because they haven't reached the point in their life yet in which their egoistic assumptions about reality, which mostly are based on propositional logic, have, we spoke about this in Big Elephant Theology. They have not been tested enough through life in performative justifications to falsify those beliefs. So what I'm saying is, give it enough time, and we'll see how far these people who could care less about wisdom today get
I'm
tomorrow.
speaking anecdotally. I'm not saying that as a mankind there is a lack of seeking wisdom. I just personally know people who could care less and would rather outsource the entire endeavor to magical thinking and the fact that they have the Holy Spirit to reduce the amount of effort that they have to put toward developing.
Right. And what I'm saying is you're just looking at one time slice in the CAT scan.
Right.
You're saying, right. You don't know what's coming upstream for them.
Right.
You just know
for
right.
Like back to McGilchrist, how you attend to things creates the reality. And it's like a completely different world for you. And anybody who's ever been in love knows this is the case. When you're here, when you're not here, a river is just a river. But when you are here, it's this grand, glorious, wonderful thing. Just being in love can change the way you see the world, and the way you attend it. So yeah, these people have come across some of the same kinds of lessons or suffering, but they just don't attend to it in a way that results in increased consciousness.
I want to pull something out of what Seraphim said that I don't think I've ever seen before, and I want to see what you guys think about the synchronicity here. When Seraphim brought out that the main trying to define, or at least more clearly define, what Vervaeke means by wisdom, seeing through the illusion, or the ability to see through the instance of an illusion. And then he nicely showed that the main feature of first tier consciousness is the development and, let's say, conglomeration and concrescence of an ego. And then the shift happens when right around green, apparently. And then what starts to become necessary in order to move into a second tier is a transcendence, which transcends the ego and starts to fracture or break it, shed it, put it to death, and come to a realization of a, let's say, less rigid state of being, a less grounded or earthly. How about a less earthly state of being? And what I kept thinking of was the chart of the spiral that Kevin had on the timeline of the Bible, and that the green, or the shift from first tier consciousness to second tier consciousness, is also analogous to the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the key feature being the gospel, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, which, when poeticized or mythologized or psychologized, is the learning of how to die to oneself, how to see through the illusion of oneself by the means of a self death, a self crucifixion, and a renewal, a burial and resurrection,
or just order, disorder, reorder.
Right. So I'm wondering,
it's the realization of that pattern.
Exactly, the realization of that pattern. Yeah.
Or dare I say the mythologization of that pattern, but either way.
Yeah. So I like thinking in terms of Christian narrative, in terms of Christian like character arc, I guess you could say. It's how I do a lot of my own personal thinking, or my own personal self reflection, contemplation, in meditation is through the appropriation of the characters that I understand in Christianity, which is mainly Jesus. So some of the artwork that I have is a perspectival exercise, or a spiritual exercise in what it's like to learn how to be crucified and to die to oneself, to die to that gut-wrenching feeling when somebody insults me, that it makes my physiological body twist and feel a weight, to try and understand that as the nails going into the hands, and I'm dying to myself. This insult is not so much put on me or on my body as it is maybe in a, is trying to understand just what it means to transcend my ego, to die to myself and see something higher, see something bigger. That's like a really intimate and very real exercise for me. And I use the Christian, I use the gospel to do that, basically. I use the contents of the gospel to live my life that way, if that makes sense. So I was just seeing a crossover of Seraphim's definition of wisdom, the utility of the first tier consciousness to second tier consciousness, and how that overlays in the narrative structure and happenings of the Bible. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like the embodied gospel. To take up the cross, to be it, to be that person being crucified. I'm a little,
but to also see it as, like, to train yourself to see it as an opportunity to transcend or break apart those aspects of yourself which are still first tier aspects.
Well, that's the essence of non-dual awareness, which is also a chief feature of second tier consciousness. I mean, I would say, if anything, the two chief features or distinguishing features of second tier is, number one, well, you could even say that they're the same, 6 of one, half a dozen the other. I mean, non-duality internally is that you sense the world non-dually, the way somebody like Marshall Davis or Rupert Spira, or I would even contend that, Ian McGilchrist sees the world non-dually, in as much as his non-duality consists of the left brain and right brain harmonization. But anyway, the two distinguishing features are just non-duality of awareness and altruism of action. And the two support each other. As soon as you achieve non-dual awareness, you know that for you there is nothing more meaningful than altruism. And the more altruistic you are, the more you're able to see the world as seamlessly one, and that we're all part of the same thing. There is no you and I. There's just what's happening as the body of Christ.
Yeah, it's got to be so gut-wrenching for certain people to hear language like that,
Well, it's ego-wrenching because it really, it's an offense to the ego. It's offense to my separate self that, the ways I've been framing the world up to now, which have brought me so much security, so much approval, so much safety, so much pleasure, are now going to crumble. And what am I going to stand on? I've heard people speak about experiences of enlightenment, right? And one of the things that they talk about most is the fact that things just bottom out. It's like there is no bottom. I seem to be floating with no connection, no way to touch, nothing to touch. It's this disorienting feeling at first, because the psyche has up to that time anchored itself in this quasi-secure, or I would say pseudo-secure artifact of the mind called the ego. But that's all the ego is. It's just an artifact. It actually doesn't really exist. The only thing that exists is God.
Well, it's like growing up. It's a child has all these securities, and everything is provided elsewhere by your parents. Your parents provide the food, clothing, shelter, love, warmth. They've provided everything you need, And as you grow older, you realize that all these things are provided by yourself, and it can be it can make one feel very unsecure. And in all reality, there's a lot of people who are living in a house right now, and they're just 2 or 3 bad decisions away from being the person under the bridge. And it's kind of frightening to realize that 2 or 3 of my decisions are the only thing standing between me being in this safe, secure place to living under a bridge somewhere alone in the rain and in the cold. It can be frightening, but spiritually, that's what has to happen too. There's all these things that make us feel safe and secure spiritually. And even when, some of the little discussions that we've had on online with some blue people, they're like, what kind of assurance are you going to offer these people? I'm like, well, I don't have any assurance to offer you. And if you're going to grow up, you're going to outgrow assurances. So that is very, like you said, Seraphim, disorienting component.
Yeah.
Growing up spiritually is to no longer have these security structures that provide the security for us.
Well, is that where we go from you and I to us? That's where we keep talking about ego, but there's another word we can use with that, which we all know, and that's pride. And so, but that can be both good and bad, if you will, depending on how we choose to.
That's a really good point, James, because it's interesting that in the West, in Western religions, we tend to use the word pride in reference to egoism, whereas in the East, they use the word ignorance. But if you think about it, pride and ignorance are exactly the same thing, because what pride is the ego establishing itself as God. The ego says, I am God. It's the statement of Satan or Lucifer. All of this is mythologized by all the understandings we have of the devil and Satan and Lucifer. All of these figures are saying, I'm going to replace myself with God and I will be God, which, if anything is ignorant, it's that statement. Because if you're thinking you're God, you got to be pretty stupid. And that's pride. That's the pride of Satan.
It was interesting because, ignorance, is just the absence of knowledge of a topic. We're all ignorant in some form or another of some topic. It was interesting to me to come across a verse today in James chapter 4, and I'll get there to it. Bear with me.
Well,
if somebody's got something to say.
While you're going to James chapter 4, William James says, our ignorance is an ocean, our knowledge is a drop. And no matter how much you learn, that's always the case. There is, you're never going to have a pond or a sea of knowledge. You have a drop. And the problem with fundamentalist religion, Christian and Islam, is that you once you get the systematic stuff down, you think you've apprehended the ocean, and you never will. And that's the pride, that's the arrogance, and then the egoic attachment to thinking that you have that knowledge, that Dunning-Kruger knowledge that you have. You don't have it. And part of waking up is the realization of the ocean, and all you have is the drop, and you're never going to have more than the drop. And it keeps you humble.
It keeps you humble?
Yeah, keeps you humble.
Just to qualify ignorance in the statement that I made, in the East, in Asian understandings, ignorance doesn't mean ignorance of, I don't know how to program a computer, I don't know how to ride a bike. Ignorance is ignorance about the true nature of the self. So a proud person is going to think that the self is what? Is this flesh, this body. And what extends from this body is its pleasures and pains. Therefore, that's the ego. So if I think that when I say I, what I'm referring to is this flesh, this body, rather than my eternal self, which is God, then I'm completely ignorant about who I really am. I think I'm this body. I take myself to be this name, my history, all the things I've learned, all my experiences. If I take that to be me, I'm ignorant, because who I really am is actually a child of God.
I want to riff on this, Seraphim, with a diagram that I've been thinking about for several weeks now. So there is the authentic self. There's you, there's the self, and there's ultimate reality. And I'm talking about the real ones here. I'm talking about the authentic self and what is really real. Well, our perception of all of that stuff is like all trapped inside here, which is society and enculturation.
So is that Vervaeke's illusion? Is that the illusion?
Yeah, I would liken this to Vervaeke's illusion. So your perspective and first tier consciousness is actually inside this red circle of society and enculturation. And
Wow.
postmodernism is essentially the recognition of that.
Hmm.
And so you're locked in there. And the closer you get to here is also the closer you get to here. You can't just do one.
Hmm.
And so the point is seeing outside of this. And what we have is we have
Oh,
metaphysics of self, you know.
so I want to add some shapes to this diagram because when you said the closer you get to self, which is basically the distancing or dissociation from the society or the illusion.
Yeah.
The further away you get from the self, the more opportunity, the more, like if you drew a what was it, what's it called, like a funnel shape. What's the funnel shape? Like a not a triangle, but the more scope you would have or opportunity you would have to see around or through the social part and actually see ultimate reality. Does that make sense? Like the Does that make sense? The more space there would be in order to see around it or through it. Yep.
You would
Yep.
have something like this.
Yes. 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 Yep. That's it. Yep.
And that would be your field of vision.
Yes. Yes. The more opportunity there is.
Yeah. Yeah. Something like that would be good. And so basically what's going on is inside of this, they tell you if you have a cup of water and you add a teaspoon of salt, it's very salty and you spit it out. But if you have a pond of water and you add a teaspoon of salt, you can barely taste it. So be the pond. As your consciousness expands, it expands in all directions. Your consciousness, when you get enculturated, is smaller. It's inside this enculturation. And then finally, one day you come across some kind of tragedy in life or failure, which forces you to bust outside the enculturation or a series of them. And hopefully one day you can expand your consciousness enough to where you're closer to the authentic self and closer to authentic reality. But ideally, actually, it's kind of asymptotic and you will likely never completely shed the ego, but you can continue to grow and get closer to both reality and self. And then I guess another way to look at it is the closer you get to self, the more you would be able to perceive reality. And also the closer you get to reality, the more you can perceive the self the other way around.
Right. So remember when you were in preschool and you got to play with all the blocks? Remember?
Yeah.
And you get to make a little house? I kind of feel like that's what we're doing right now.
So if I left these as a point, like an isosceles triangle, let's do this. Let's do this with a point real quick and watch the shape that we get. That's not what I meant to do. Watch the shapes that we get if we do this with a point, like a triangle. We're gonna go. We'll use this kind of triangle, and we'll make it as a point. And I'll make it transparent,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then we'll bring it over here so you can kind of see in and around a little bit as much as possible. We'll make it big so it goes bigger. And then let's make that a little bit transparent. And then when you come from the other side, you get something like this, doing the same thing. Now, as I tidy those up, look what we get.
How can the phrase that for me to live is Christ and to die is gain be applied here.
I mean, does that look familiar? Does anybody recognize that shape though?
Oh yeah.
This is a sideways Star of David. It makes you wonder
Yeah,
if
Yep.
Star of David.
they were onto something, or like when the Masons have the
Yeah,
square and the compass,
yeah,
or male and female of the chalice and the
yes,
cup,
yeah.
and the blade,
The blade in the chalice. Yeah,
the chalice. That's very interesting. And
yeah,
so
it is.
it almost seems like, so,
Oh,
you know, I just want everybody in the audience to realize we just did this on the fly. And
Yeah,
if you think that we've got it from the Masons or something like that, all it is potential conversions. You know, we're not getting it from anywhere. We might call it rediscovery. So
how many things that are done on purpose are not? How many
What?
things that are done on purpose are not for a certain reason or to imply a certain? I don't know how to frame that right.
Well, let's, like your other question, to live as Christ is to, and to die is gain. The more we get to, like, your false self is trapped inside here. The more that false self dies, the more you can gain real self and ultimate reality.
Exactly.
Something like that.
wow.
Like Nick was talking about, that crucifixion of the self. I was kind of stunned when he was saying that, because I'm going through a period right now where I'm just going to say this live on YouTube. My children right now are under absolute imminent existential threat. And I've been through all kinds of efforts, legal and otherwise, to try to do something about it. And there's nothing that I can do about it. And as the father, it makes you feel like an inadequate father. So, I mean, what you might say is that I'm going through an ego death right now, where I have to straight up face my own failure of being able to protect my kids from imminent existential threat. Nothing I can do. And I'm not trying just to take the conversation away from.
No, it's interesting when things are out of our
just to let you
control.
know, like the little difficulties that we have, that we go through, you have to bring this consciousness into them.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
Right.
not to distract further, but my wife and I just watched Pete's Dragon. And I don't know if anybody's seen the 1977 Pete's Dragon, because they remade it, and I haven't seen the remake, but it seems like they missed all the important parts of the mythopoetic stuff. But when Nora is facing reality with Pete's dragon in it, you know, the dragon of chaos is part of her reality now, she decides to sing this song. It's a brazzle dazzle day. It's a brazzle dazzle day. And to maintain hope and optimism and gratitude in the midst of facing a dragon is what's necessary. And then while they're singing this song, the grandpa and her and the kid are all on this little scaffolding hoist, and they're hoisting themselves up the side of a lighthouse, which shows that the more you while facing your dragons, the more you maintain a positive outlook with gratitude, the higher you get to the light. You ascend to the light by not being cynical, not being nihilistic, maintaining a positive, altruistic outlook, while she's still altruistically offering to help voluntarily adopt responsibility for this child that is not hers. Because all that's right there. It's mythopoetically undeniable. Right there in Pete's Dragon, 1977. So, like, while I'm facing this dragon of this imminent threat to my kids, I have to maintain gratitude without and a positive outlook and altruistic outlook without giving in to hate or nihilism or cynicism or any of those things, or becoming grapes or resentfulness, you know. And that's what each person, to attend properly to the pain and failure that you're going through, is what is absolutely necessary in order to ascend to the light as you go through the pain and face the dragon.
Yeah.
Makes me think of this. Go ahead. Go ahead, Nathan.
The symbol of a lighthouse is also not exactly, but it's also in the shape of that pyramid. It's a hierarchical shape, if you will.
It's an obelisk, but still, it's still got that shape. Yeah.
The story that you're sharing, Kevin, makes me think of the story that David gives us when their whole family and their whole community, if you will, is attacked. And here they've just came back from war. And while they were at battle, their family and their livelihood, their homes is all destroyed, and their wives and their children are taken captive. And they're all discouraged. David's discouraged. The only thing he could turn around and say to share his experience with us is that he encouraged himself in the Lord. And with that being said, only him and a few of those men went back to capture get those that were captured and bring them back home. And not all of them went with them. But when they came back, this speaks of what Seraphim was talking about. When they all came back, none of them begrudged those that didn't go with them. They all had the privilege to enjoy and rejoice and to be considered in the outcome and in the receiving of the reward. And that's why we all play our part, yes, but it's still about us. And I'm not talking about in the modern progressivism idea of stage we're talking about today in our world, but I'm talking about in the sense of, considering one another in life.
Yeah.
It's an individual choice. It's not something that should be dominioned over us by a governance of a governor. And that's hard, don't get me wrong. It'd be hard to come back from a situation like that and pride or the ego not be involved. It'd be very hard.
Of course. Yeah.
That difficulty, facing that difficulty.
Absolutely.
Going back to Pete's dragon, it is the dragon of chaos that winds up at the end of the movie. Spoiler alert. Hope people have seen it. It's from 1977. It's not like it's in the theaters right now. But at the end of the movie, it's the dragon that relights the lighthouse. And the dragon is what relights the lighthouse that allows you to see, to overcome the storm of being lost and having lost the memory of where you need to be oriented. Because Paul, the dude who's coming back, he gets amnesia from a shipwreck and forgets where he is. And the dragon flips his bed over, he gets his memory back. The chaos, the dragon of chaos, is what jars your head, gets you reoriented back to where you are, and provides the little glimmer of light that you need to see to be reoriented back to where you need to go.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because people often, when we speak of ego, it's a really difficult thing to distinguish for some, especially first here, between ego, which is a very useful function created by God that we don't want to destroy because it is an artifact of God. Ego is one thing. Egoism is another. Egoism is the ideology that's built on the worship and exaltation of the ego as if the ego is God rather than a servant of God. And that, dragon, I see, dragons, devils, Satan, Lucifer, all those images are just ways of talking about different aspects of egoism. It's when the ego is just the body, but egoism is the flesh. It's making the body an idol and treating it and pampering it and making it the most important thing in your life. This is another good distinction when St. Paul talks about, carnality versus just the body. We know the body is holy. The physical body was created in the image of likeness of God. That's one thing. But when you exalt the body to the level of being an idol, then it becomes the dragon or Lucifer or whatever. It starts, dragging down all that sacred energy that you should be having the ego direct toward God.
Wow. like that was said so quick, but like the dragging down of that sacred energy was like the degeneration of the vertical move, like the drag. Oh my gosh,
The
just
dragon.
the dragging down of that sacred energy was. You said it so fast and
Right.
so nonchalantly, but that was really profound. Like I saw it like kind of like sucking the
Yeah.
sacred significance out of the thing and like
Right.
dispersing it out where it's not valuable anymore. It gets inflated or
And those are the horizontal
not worth.
serpents, right? The serpent power being
Yes.
drawn down are the
Yes.
horizontal serpents on the
Yes.
desert, but the serpent
Yes.
raised up
The
is the
snake pit.
healing serpent, right? So
Yes.
egoism is
Oh.
that being drugged down, the serpent
Yeah.
or the snake's being drugged down. The ego being exalted to God's glory is actually
Is the
the serpent lifted up.
vertically going on the pole. Right.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
Two aspects
Yeah.
of the dragon, the good and the bad. And the dragon lifted on the pole is the dragon lighting the lighthoess. Because
Yeah.
when it's lifted up, the bronze serpent
Yes.
shines
Yes.
and heals, right?
Yes, it's going up the pyramid. Yeah.
Right.
As long as we don't start bringing snakes into this conversation, I will be just fine with it.
Just hearing this almost makes me tear up with.
Oh, wow.
Why do you say that, Kevin?
I know I just feel it in my body. I feel like
Yeah.
I feel like I'm as you Seraphim and Nick are talking back and forth, I feel like my body feels like it's being lowered into comfortable warm water that's life-giving when I'm freezing. I don't know how to describe that. Something like that. There's
Watch out for that Kundalini there.
Oh gosh.
He'll bite you if you're not looking.
Apparently. So I think it's what you brought out. I think there are different sets of lenses that we could put on. And what the focus that you drew our attention to, Seraphim, was the focus of the role of the ego with regard to different levels of consciousness or growth or development. And I think that's probably the most consistent element or set of lenses through which you can see any situation and realize, okay, what's the state of the ego here? What's wrong in terms of ego? What is going on here for any situation that's maybe wrong or bad? Like my wife and I watch these reality dating shows sometimes just as like background noise while we're cooking lunch or dinner or something like that, or cleaning the kitchen. And then we'll pause it and we'll talk about what's going on. But I think there are lots of different lenses you can put on. Like let's put on the lenses of left and right hemisphere. So as you're talking about ego just a second ago, the bringing down, the lateral movement and the usurping of the authority, that's, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, lateral, vertical, that whole thing too. And so for any of the different things, you could have a set of any different situation. You could have a set of lenses that you put on, like what's going on with the ego here? What's going on with the left, right hemisphere here? What's going on in any number of other things? Are they trying to come to truth by science, intuition, reason, or imagination? And if they're doing something wrong, which one of those four things are missing? Like they say, a madman is not somebody who has abandoned reason, but somebody who has nothing else but reason. So what's missing here? What of the four kinds of knowing? If there's a problem, what's missing there? And 4E cognition, what is not being tended to here? Or we have multiple different intelligences, like cognitive, emotional, moral, ethical, aesthetic, spiritual, according to Ken Wilber. Social, bodily, kinesthetic, and each one of those intelligences can have their own degree of consciousness. Any one of those kinds of intelligences can be anywhere on the spiral, different than one of the other ones. So what's going on there? So I think there's all kinds of different lenses that we can put on, that we need to have some kind of literacy and a variety of different ways of looking at things. I tend to think that the ego issue is probably everything else kind of is umbrellaed underneath that in some way. And that's probably the most consistent thing that's going on with any of the other issues. If you want to, okay, what's the problem here? Well, ego's the most consistent thing that's always a problem when the situation has gone bad or is not ideal. Trying to let somebody get into my head for a second and almost, those little things the viewfinder things you used to look through as a kid and give you a bunch of different pictures or maybe colors to see through like binoculars. When I'm looking at a problem, these are all kinds of things that I'm looking at. Like, where are they in spiral dynamics? Where are they in Fowler stages of faith? What's going on with the left and right hemisphere? What's going on with the ego in this situation? So I'm going to put on all these different lenses and analyze separately through there. And it might have a score range in 25 different categories. And that's how I'm going to analyze the situation and then move forward from there. And then like you and I were talking about, Nick, we could take that kind of thing. You could take it into any situation, like into a business or an organization or to a team. You could even take it to a football team or my wife working with the Department of Education for Louisiana and take these kind of analyses into the team and help them get a prescription for what could be improved where and how, depending on what they're trying to accomplish.
I know that. I know that Seraphim, actually, him and I have spoken about in the past on the I don't know if it's really a growing paradigm, but the philosophical counseling community. It's sort of elusive, at least in the area that I'm in on the East Coast. It's hard to find anybody who's endeavoring to grow that initiative. But to my understanding, somebody who would be engaged in philosophical counseling would be focused on sort of performing exactly what Kevin just said, is kind of looking, not necessarily having to be proficient or even, nuanced in the particular domain of business or of community or of schooling or education or whatever.
It could be a welding shop. It could be a medical institution.
But somebody who understands and knows, has the skills and tools to be able to look at what's the architecture or the structure that's undergirding the contents of this domain, and how to present a format and a procedure in order to get the people involved to look at it more closely, give them a language set or a quote spiritual exercise to be able to look at the thing and problematize it and or diagnose and or come up with some sort of creative solution to that problem identification. But because Kevin had brought up to me that there seems to be so many people that in the, let's say, psychological or mental health or social health field that have a monopoly over the accreditization and or licensing, and it just seems
perceived as credible.
Right. And he had rightly brought out that seems to be done just in terms to satisfy like liability and legal happenings and stuff like that. But it just seems to me that none of those accreditations or licenses really improve the quality of service that it seems to be they trying to employ.
Yeah, they tend to make people feel safe because it quack proofs somebody. Like if they've been to medical school and they have all the certifications and everything, well, they're not a quack, but it also doesn't mean they're great. They're not going to be the person that designs the new plastic throat that enables a little boy to live that otherwise wouldn't have. You don't learn that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I've been kind of trying to backdoor encourage Kevin to at least consider and try to find a way to use the skills that he has demonstrated on Beyond the Fundamentals to offer that kind of a service to, again, like, the channel is so, quote, church or Christian specific, but like Kevin rightly said, once you've kind of accessed these, quote, philosophical tools, or just these basic tools, you can bring them into any domain regardless of the contents of that domain, and be able to be helpful, be useful, be insightful, be a force for the good. And as far as I can tell, that's what a Christian ought to be doing. Is just that, So I'm kind of excited and hopeful that that does something approximating that loose description is able to come out of this channel, because I think that Kevin especially is really, really, really been honing a skill set which would be super, super helpful to not just people on YouTube who want to gain comfortability or watch somebody destroy Calvinism, like that. Like, it's so far beyond that. I tried to bring that out with my conversation with George a week ago, where it's like, it kind of feels like, George just watched the channel, saw somebody beat the crap out of Calvinism, and wanted to just, like, almost use Kevin and his skills in order to bolster his own ideological amusement. And it's like, Kevin in Beyond the Fundamentals is so much more than that. It's so much more useful than just beating the crap out of hypothetical digital James Whites. You know what I'm saying? So I hope that.
Yeah, I spoke to someone recently who thought the best next step for Kevin and Beyond the Fundamentals was to start turning his attention toward Buddhists and Muslims and all these other types, because he does such a good job against Calvinists. It's like, okay, yeah, let's turn BTF into the new Inquisition. Great idea.
Well,
Yeah.
I actually think that going against Calvinism is kind of a mistake. And
Yes.
it's weird. It's weird because starting that endeavor is what brought things to where they are now, which I think, to me, I feel like I can see further and more clearly than I could before. But part of that vision is by whatever you resist persists. And I think that I've actually given life to Calvinism in a way,
Yeah.
without realizing that I was doing so. That wasn't my intent, but that's because I was stupid and I was getting something other than my intent.
Yeah.
And how do we make Calvinism drift off into obscurity, kind of like Nazism? I'm not trying to compare Calvinism with Nazism and its severity and all that, but it's just a bankrupt philosophy, and it's almost like we are giving it undeserved attention by continuing to resist it like that.
Yeah.
Yes, in other words, you were fanning the flames, you were stirring the fire.
Right, giving people something to be against.
So,
for example, like when we've had these people that have went out and done a mass shooting or whatever horrific crime they did, instead of bringing attention to them and being willing to mention their name, we always choose to give
victims. Yep.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're not going to get famous by doing this, buddy. And so, I mean, in reality, Calvinism is an artifact of red and blue thinking that part of society needs to go through in order for mankind to progress to where it's going. It's not going to be around forever, but it may be a few thousand years before we get humanity to the level of consciousness to where things like provisionism and Calvinism are seen as futile pursuits. I kind of think that.
Well, they can't be seen as futile pursuits until you live through them.
Right. Yeah. You have to experientially know that they're futile pursuits.
Well, that's why it's not just Calvinism. I mean, we're not talking so much about a category as we are can I put it this way, a mindset. Correct me if this is not the best word to use, but narcissistic. I mean, and there may be Seraphim, a better medical term for that than to offend somebody by calling them a narcissist. But that's why I look at the situation with George in this way. His offense wasn't towards Calvinism. I mean, he admits he came out of that. I think he was taking offense to whether he liked it or not, to the sense that Kevin was going beyond that of Calvinism to that of the picture of the church and the structures and the things that Kevin's went through, and as many people in life. And George was taking offense to that personally because he felt like that picture, that model, take him out of it or not, was being bashed. And I'm not saying that to George's defense. I'm just saying that was where George was. That's how George. I think that's where George was coming offended at. Kevin's not willing to give credit to any four-walled entity of a church of being something that could be modeled, other than, if you will, as Kevin brings out, Ephesians, the model in Ephesians. But here he wasn't getting the other concept, and he just was. It was just to me, it was a battle back and forth about, if you will, and no disrespect anywhere, but of what Seraphim's talked about here earlier, and we all have, about egos and egoism.
Yeah.
What if we express that in a different domain? Because in the religious domain, people are bringing in a different kind of moral intelligence to it. So if we take it in the realm of, let's take it in the realm of politics. Rush Limbaugh. I was a huge fan of Rush Limbaugh. Love Rush Limbaugh. Subscribe to the channel. Listen to it all the time. And what that did is, even though I thought he was right in his opposition to Democrats and liberalism, progressivism, all that, it kept me in this boxed in rivalrous mindset of us versus them. And
right.
Before he died, I started to wake up to the fact that it's almost like this game where the people opposing each other are willing participants in an overall game, almost like I don't know how the Saints and the Lions are doing today, but they're playing the meta game of the NFL needs to do well. And there's a meta game of media, and the more rivalry there is, the more attention you get.
Yes.
You think? The more worked up people get, the more you can sell advertising. So there's like this meta game of that. And after Rush Limbaugh passed away, God rest his soul, I stopped listening to any kind of political stuff whatsoever. And I found myself seeing the entire situation kind of from outside of it, rather than from being an embattled participant in it.
That's the yellow systems view.
Yeah. And
Kevin, you brought up the Daily Wire the other day, and
I just want to push the pause button just for a second, Nick, and just say that I want people in the religious domain to realize that the same thing is going on in our churches, and we need to kind of back off what we see as opposing systems, kind of look at it from a zoomed out view.
Yeah.
Anyway, what you were saying, Nick, with the Daily Wire?
Well, just along the same stream of thought there, like you mentioned the Daily Wire the other day, and I actually just saw a commercial that the Daily Wire has become a movie production. Like, they have a movie production studio, and they're coming out with this movie that is like a satire and a poke at a lot of super easy picking red and blue level discussions, such as transgender participation in competitive sports. So it's this entire movie. I don't know if anybody's seen the trailer for it, but it's an entire movie about a bunch of guys who are mediocre, sort of average Joe sort of guys, and they figure out that they can pretend to be girls and just go dominate all of these female sports, and they end up winning. I'm assuming they end up winning a bunch of stuff. And I don't know if I trust the Daily Wire, because of like Ben Shapiro and the guys that are part of the day. I mean, Jordan Peterson's part of the Daily Wire now too, and it's like those are super intelligent guys as far as I can tell. However, it really, really bothers me. It actually, watching the trailer for that movie was really disturbing to me.
So,
But
yeah,
just don't conflate IQ and quality of consciousness, because I hear that all the time too with George
right.
Antonios.
You
I
think
agree,
because
he's an
somebody's
absolute
smart.
genius, but that doesn't say anything about his quality of consciousness. Same thing with Peterson and Shapiro.
Yeah, so it really bothers me that they're taking this. It almost seems like bullying to me, to be honest with you. Like they're mocking the things that, some people may be going through, and they're making a satire movie about it to make fun of it. And again, I'll laugh if it's funny. If it's funny, I will laugh.
Right.
But I would expect that the level of seriousness to which they are bringing meaning to certain people's lives, that they would also bring and understand that, like, this movie is really, really going to rub a lot of people the wrong way, and a lot of people who are on the other side of the aisle. And so they're
Going to
not,
fuel antagonism and
it's
rivalry.
total, that's
People
it.
are
It's
going to double
total
down.
antagonism. And
So
I don't expect that from people like that, but
I want to talk about it. I think this is an opportunity where wisdom can come in. I think there's some signal in the fact that the transgender thing has become like a movement should be concerning. And here's what I think is happening, and here's where I think we need to have a dialogue. We need to be in dialogue with people. And I feel like the transgender movement is people who are realizing that this red circle is a construct, and they're bouncing against the edges of it, really in postmodern fashion. They're not meta modern yet. They're still postmodern mindset.
yeah,
And so
yeah.
they're bouncing against the edges of this, realizing that it's a construct. And they're right. They're right about that. In their realization that society and enculturation is a construct, that is signal. Now, what they're doing with it, I think the pendulum is swinging too far, and they're causing a lot of unnecessary damage in people's lives because it has become, the ideology of it has a very blue structure. It's got a morality to it, and a certain kind of belief system, a lot of do's and don'ts, and they're telling clinicians what they can and can't say. So I think that this pendulum is swinging the wrong way, but I think that the wise approach is to look at things like that may seem appalling to somebody. Say, what's the signal here? What's going on with the signal here? And as we have the dialogue and address what the symbol is, how do we do it in a way where we still treat everybody involved with dignity and respect? Okay. And
What is the name of this film?
Well,
I'm not sure.
Are they telling this story, or are they telling a story of what's taking place, or are they the one, if you will, creating the story, making the story?
They're making the story, and I'm sure they're dragging instances that they talk about on their podcasts, about, transgender wrestler, high school wrestler, winning states and dominating all of the whatever, the girls or whatever. But I do want to stick close to what Kevin was just getting at here, because
I want to give another example real quick to take it into so a lateral example can help get a meta perspective. If you take the issue of abortion, for example, it's not right now, it seems to be operating at the level of should it or should it not be legal. And the main two philosophies behind this are women's rights. They should not be legislated what they can and can't do with their bodies, which I think is a very valid concern. And then there's the idea of killing human beings. And I think that is a very valid concern. Both are very valid concerns. And to just silence the other side without silence the other side leaves one of those harmed. You're either going to kill humans or violate women's rights. So the ultimate goal I think everybody should be striving for is one where women have complete right and autonomy over their bodies, and nobody is electively killed in or out of the womb. That would be the ultimate goal. And so we ought to, instead of just trying to pass a law to disregard one of those concerns, how do we get to a reality where both of those concerns come into fray? How do we
Yes.
both?
Come into fruition.
That's a hard problem, and
Well, yeah,
we're working with people to try to find that solution.
yeah, because what you're
Stomp each other down by legislating what that view is.
yeah, what you're trying to do in essence is not help fan the flame of rivalry, but it looked like you were trying to encourage people to actually search more for what's the correct question or problem, like what is the actual problem that people are asserting or moving towards. So so basically, is it actually the problem that women, like, is women's choice over what to do with their body really a good description of what the actual problem is? And if we can we raise the resolution of language there and actually understand it?
Right.
So it's like
an ill-defined problem, an ill-defined ideal end state. What's the ideal end state? And if you're like, well, the ideal end state is that women aren't told to do with their bodies, that's half the problem.
right.
Because we also don't want innocent humans being killed, and you have to value all life in an altruistic way. So you can't just solve half the problem. We need to solve both sides, where neither side, where women's rights aren't being violated and human beings aren't being killed.
So I'm thinking again of, instead of me and you, us or we, how do we come together again?
Yes.
And like you're talking about, Kevin, and focus on the real picture.
But one of the good things that's happening is Daily Wire has been having, like they were doing this before, they're having conversations with people like Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Yang, and they're calm conversations, and they're not just sound bites, and they're not just yelling each other down. They're having dialogues, and then they're bringing people like Jonathan Haidt onto the program, who's always been liberal, Democrat, atheist, and they're having calm conversations, and they're learning from each other on these things. The intellectual dark web, I thought, was a fantastic thing where people in long form could express what they're actually thinking without these soundbite arguments. Anyway, go ahead and finish your thought, James, and then Seraphim's waiting to say something too.
Yes, because come, let us reason together. It's a matter of being willing to hear each other's side and not become rivals. I mean, hear each other out. Whether I change your opinion or you change mine, being willing to have reason and consideration for one another, instead of, back to Seraphim's, egoism. It's all about, my way or the highway, or what I think, and you're right, you're wrong, and I'm right, or whatever.
Yeah. So I really need to piggyback off of something what James is saying, so that the Christian audience here can apply this. So that mentality of trying to, quote, reason together, which is to try and assert your efforts in asking the right question about the current situation. What that means is that, like, when somebody like George is asking somebody like Kevin, well, do you believe in the deity of Christ? And George is asserting with all in this almost like tyrannizing way, that the most relevant thing right now in this conversation between you and me is whether or not you affirm the deity of Christ. That's bullying, and that's conversational tyranny, where he's defining the parameters of what we're going, like what the most relevant thing is. And that's
a manufactured confusion.
Yes, I called it manufactured confusion because I felt like from George, and I hate talking about him without him here, but I feel like with George, there's this willful effort to fan the flame. There's this willful effort to manufacture a level of confusion in order to create this stance where he is righteous and adhering to the fundamentals, and you're kind of like, dude, like you're pulling me away here, like this. It seems very and I don't take it the wrong way, but it just seems very ingenuine, and I'm very suspicious of it. But I tried to be as charitable and non-confrontational as possible because I didn't want to let things get volatile. But anyhow, I just wanted to relay from what James was saying that the way that a Christian needs to be open to engaging in this type of dialogue where it's productive, it's mutually productive, is to be careful and be weary when you are the one setting the parameters of relevance for the problem. Like, so you can't just constrain somebody by saying, well, the bottom line is the gospel. If you don't believe the gospel, then the conversation's over. And it's like, you can't do that. That's super immature. That's the same thing as the 4-year-old who, because we're not using the blue colored blocks, goes, well, I'm going home. That's the same level of maturity, and it's abysmal. Yeah. So sorry, Seraphim.
That's okay. Those are all good points. I just wanted, there's a little discussion in the chat that I really think it's important to clear up the difference between IQ and wisdom, or intelligence and wisdom. This is again going from Vervecki. Okay. So Vervecki is saying that intelligence is just the ability to solve problems, to reach goals, to recognize patterns, right? This is just a basic skill which could be deployed at any level of any tier or any stage of consciousness. Wisdom, however, is the ability to look at a so-called problem and not only wonder whether it's a problem or not, but to then be able to identify things that weren't even on the radar as being problems. In other words, wisdom can take a systems view or a bird's eye view, or what I like to call an upstream view of those things that we call problems, and completely defamiliarize them so that people go, oh, wait, that wasn't a problem at all, was it? We were just framing the problem in such a way that we thought our intelligence for solving problems could handle it. But in fact, now that we've seen this other perspective in which these problems aren't problems, that's the wisdom moment. Okay, so it's the reframing of things that intelligence handles in order to obviate them as problems. So let's take the abortion issue. With the abortion issue, I like to go back to the serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So that, to me, let's say that I'm a voting citizen considering the abortion issue. The things I can change in that debate are, well, I can vote. I can cast my vote for whether I think women should have an abortion or not. That's about the only way I can really change things. Now, there are other ways I might fantasize that I might change things, like go to a rally or go to a protest or carry signs or bomb an abortion clinic or whatever. But those are actually kind of outside the realm of the things I cannot change, because even if I went to the extreme of doing something like bombing an abortion clinic, it's really not going to change very much, and it'll probably make my side worse. So when I'm thinking about that realm of wisdom, that little window of wisdom of the things that I cannot change, I think about the way that wisdom will be able to get a view such that like James was saying, we see both sides. So instead of spending our time at rallies and working on a bomb or whatever, instead of directing our attention toward that, we direct our attention toward doing a deep dive into trying to understand both sides. Because the thing is, God actually is on both sides. How do we know God is on both sides? Well, because both sides are advocating for a virtue. The pro-life people are advocating for life, which is a virtue. That's God's side. But the pro-choice people are advocating for freedom and liberty. That's also God's side, because God likes freedom and liberty too. So what a wisdom systems view would do is look at both sides and see where God is in that struggle, and then taking that perspective, trying to find that magical third thing that emerges from the opponent processing, in this case, the opponent processing of liberty, which is God, and of life, which is God. That opponent processing is going to reveal a magical third thing, but God's only going to reveal himself in that case if both sides are willing to commit to a goodwill effort to finding the wisdom in that moment.
Right.
What I've come to with the abortion issue is this. I've seen that really what both sides should admit is the real problem is not that women want to have abortions. The problem is why a woman would want to have an abortion in the first place. Like, that's not a natural thing.
Yeah.
But clearly, something in society is making people force the choice of wanting to get rid of their baby. Why would they want to do that? Well, because we live in a society that doesn't support life at all in any other corner. We live in a pro-death culture. So is it going to be surprising that this one little isolated moment, women are going to decide to get rid of their babies if they have this intuition as mothers that I don't want to bring a baby into this society because everything in the society militates against life. Why would I want to do that? So if we address that larger issue of the society as a whole being a pro-death culture, we might then be able to kind of focus on this kind of more isolated problem is why a woman would want to get rid of her baby.
Yeah.
I think there's multiple facets to that as well.
Yeah.
It's not like what you said is, that's, having a pro-death culture could lead to nihilism. And I think that there's a lot of behavioral issues among men and women, like using sex as a means of fulfilling beige desires without any forethought or sagacity about the consequences. And
living in an economy actually which encourages that behavior. I mean, think about it. Our whole culture is set up to encourage beige level sexuality.
Right.
Is it going to be freaking surprising that people are going to get pregnant from that? Do you think an individual, like single little girl, 18 years old, is going to be able to fight the full force of our culture, always militating upon them to do this thing? It's crazy. And then hold them responsible when they want to get rid of a baby that was the result of being immersed in a pro-death culture.
Yeah. So I would say that I would agree totally with the direction that the conversation's going in terms of the contents of the abortion conversation. What I want to relate to you guys that I'm feeling right now is that part of the reason that I think the conversation has not taken the turn that Seraphim has proposed and Kevin has obliged is because of the daunting dragon of chaos that it seems like would need to be slain in order to actually come to a resolution. So it feels just way too
dragon of chaos. Like what does that look like to you? What are you referring to?
Like just the time, energy, and platform that would need to be provided in order for people to have the opportunity to work out that third thing that Seraphim was able to come up with on his own. Like that was Seraphim's third of the two opponent processing, life and freedom. He came up with the third, and that was his own. But that was a very daunting thing, and to get X amount of millions of people to be able to have the time, the skill set, and the platform to be able to work that third out is like a whole dragon in itself. So it's like, why don't we just expedite? Let's just keep it red and blue. Let's keep it life and freedom, and let's just duke it out. And whoever wins,
dualism is the easier choice, right?
It's more expedient.
It's easier to lobby. For a dualistic mindset, and so there's this underlying concern of if you could imagine, if we apply wisdom, ideally we would want sex to never happen from a beige standpoint, right? Because you're going to wind up with this kind of thing. So you could imagine,
or I would say not promoted by the economy. I mean, people are going to have sex for pleasure regardless. They've been doing it for centuries. But to have an economy and a media that's bent on that and that promotes it, that's what I'm referring to.
It's funny because I'm thinking about coming out with a video that addresses this, and how I think fundamentalist churches are the enabler of sex to be promoted in everyone's salience landscape by a scarcity economy.
Right.
That would be good.
Yeah. Through the enculturation all the way from the Puritans up till today. Really all the way back to Jerome. But the point that I want to bring about, though, is when you look at from the concept of religion, with the religion that's not a religion kind of thing. If you look at how do we enculturate people to not have beige level sex with complete disregard for the consequences? How do we do that? I think we could all easily imagine how it's a lot easier to just refer it to boil it all down to, well, God doesn't say it. I mean, God says not to, right? And that's easy, but eventually people get to the place in their life where that is no longer satisfactory for how they're making their decisions. And I think Christians today, it is incumbent upon us to, when we are advocating wise choices, that we advocate the reasons behind why those choices are wise, rather than just resort it all down to a divine ethic that God said it. Like, here's why this is a good idea. Here's why this might not be a good idea. Here's all the different things to consider. Here's all the different things that will be affected. Here's all the different things that are probably influencing you to make a good or a bad choice. There it all is. Now let's learn how to make decisions, instead of, like, if suddenly, you know, like the movie Bruce Almighty, if suddenly you were placed in the wisdom with coming up in the position of having to come up with God's wisdom, what cognitive, logical resources would you bring into play to come up with that wisdom? And then we now erase that component from it. You're not God, but here's the wisdom and here's how it pans out. And let's pass that down instead of a overly superstitious, simplistic, magical thinking, divine ethic of God said it. Because I don't think the God said it thing, I'm not denying that God said it. What I'm saying is that it doesn't work as a component to enculturate people into being wise.
Yeah. It's not sufficient. It's not sufficient for a conscientious 10-year-old or 8-year-old when
right.
His parents tell him to clean his room and he goes, well, why? Well, because I said so. Well, the 8-year-old doesn't accept that. The conscientious 8-year-old. What makes you think a conscientious, fully grown, matured 35-year-old would? We've got to grow up.
Intelligence. And when it comes to moral intelligence, when we're giving people moral reasons to do things, one of them, the number 6 in moral foundations, is sanctity degradation. And if that's the only reason that you're telling people to not do things, eventually that's going to fade, and you're going to wind up with a society that's doing what we're doing now. So because God said so does not cut it as far as as far as cultivating wisdom in people.
And I think that part of Jordan Peterson's contribution to the to society at large has been, he actually has done a amazing job at justifying and reminding society why God said so. This is, he did a great job, I think, with reminding us and rerouting and reestablishing why, the reason why God said thou shalt XYZ, and did a good job of tracing and attaching those reasons, why they are true, why those are true words, why the word of God is quick and powerful and true, in all of those things. So it's going to take a higher level of explanation and reason in order to discover just why these things are true, these propositions are true, like the God said so XYZ.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot, though, has been lost in American Protestant culture because, I'm coming from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, just thinking about the way I raised my son, the way, like, Eastern Orthodox, for example, talk about, like, fighting. Let's just talk about fighting. Drag a couple boys off the field because they were fighting. Why shouldn't we fight? Because God said so, or whatever. We, in the Orthodox Church, say, because we're all made in the image of God. You're not gonna beat the face of God, are you? That person that you are hitting is in the image of God. Same thing with cleaning your room. You don't clean your room because God said so. You clean your room because it's beneath the dignity of a child of God to have a room looking like that. So, like, to appeal to people's inner divinity seems like it's been lost in Protestantism because Protestants are so afraid of theosis. Like I engage a lot with you guys in your
I
community,
wanted to bring this up earlier
yeah,
because when you were talking about the ego becoming God,
right.
I think when you talk about theosis, first tier consciousness people can only imagine the ego becoming God because that's their sense
Exactly
of
right.
self. And that's
Right.
why it's such a
Oh,
blasphemy.
okay.
Right.
Okay.
And that's
Okay.
what they always think. Whenever I talk about theosis, the first thing they think is, oh, the ego, the ego can't become God. We're not talking about the ego. We're
Right.
talking about your divine nature, your likeness with God. And in the Orthodox Church, this is so completely plain. That's why we have icons. We have icons to remind us that these saints became like Christ in the holy lives they led, and the holy lives they led lived up to the fullness of stature of Christ in living up to that human dignity. So,
Yeah.
so the basic understanding of any kind of sin is not sin is wrong because God said not to do it. Sin is wrong because it's beneath your human dignity as a child of God to be acting that way.
Wow. Okay, so this makes a lot of sense now because you're saying that on the whole, Protestants are afraid of the process of theosis, and it's like what I'm thinking about right now is Martin Luther. And I'm
Right.
thinking about how in Martin Luther's Bondage of the Will,
Yeah.
he's so like involved
Self-absorbed. Yeah. Self-absorbed.
and
Right.
self-absorbed
Yeah.
that it's like
Yeah.
he can't, it's like his ego talking about his ego in
Right.
his ego, and there is none but the
Yeah.
ego, and all his ego does is sin. So it's sin, sin, sin
That's
everywhere.
because all the ego can do is sin. That's its
And
only ability.
and so it's like he has no out there. He becomes so self-entrapped that where I think about my own development as a person, and although I did come to the realization at a certain point about right and wrong, and like, my own proclivity to do things that are not becoming, um but I have to finish that with becoming of what? And the becoming of what is more fundamental, which is the divine nature that is within
Right.
me.
Right.
That is the baseline metric that I use to even call something a sin to begin with, making it more fundamental.
But that was the fundamental sensibility of Christianity for the first several hundred years of the church. All Christians understood, without even needing to say so explicitly, that the whole point of becoming a Christian was to become like God. Because when you're a child of God, you take on God's nature, like any other child. My son is like me. He's
Yeah,
not
what
me,
does it
but
mean to
he's
be a
like me
child of God?
because he's got my last name and he's going to inherit my possessions, and he basically is a reflection of me. It's a non-dual relationship, and all Christians understood this categorically until Christendom was put into the hands of lawyers like Augustine and others. And the church realized, I mean, the official church, not the mystical church, the church realized, if people start going around thinking they're going to be God, we're going to have a problem in our hands because they're not going to need us anymore to mediate their relationship with God through confession and all the other ecclesiastical trappings. So here's what we'll do. We'll set up this magisterium, this intermediary institution between people and God, and say, no, not only are you not going to be able to get to God, you're certainly not going to become God, which is your natural birthright, because you need the Pope and all of his cardinals and confession to mediate that relationship. Now, Protestantism inherited that view. So Protestantism, instead of like looking closely, like Martin Luther, you were just talking about, going back to the early church and understanding the basic sensibility of theosis, like, the ultimate statement was made by the church father who initiated the Nicene Council. He said, God became man that man might become God. This was something that everybody understood. This was not considered heresy at all. Everybody applauded this, but that understanding was lost, and then it was inherited by Protestantism. So this is our problem with not understanding the basic dignity.
It's the John 17 prayer that they may be one, even as me and you are one.
Right.
And to think that Jesus's prayer was ever answered with a yes makes you a heretic.
Yeah. But this is not the fault of Protestantism. This is the fault of Protestants inheriting a sensibility from the Catholic Church and not properly reforming what they should have reformed, right? all the reforms that were made
It's
were,
almost like they took it in a wrong direction too.
yeah,
It's almost like the Catholic Church did have some corruption which needed to be addressed and some things that needed to be reformed, but the several different components such as widespread literacy, the printing press, reading silently, things like this caused Christianity to be reduced to a set of apprehendable ideas
right.
rather than an experiential path.
Mm-hmm.
The way that is Christ got reduced to a set of ideas that replace Christ via idolatry.
And that process, going back to the spiral, happened in the general cultural transfer from blue to orange. So orange is essentially Protestantism. Blue is essentially Catholicism. So a lot of those blue elements kind of bled into those orange qualities. And people who became predominantly individualistic and rationalistic and moralistic, as Protestants did, failed to see that a lot of these blue qualities that bled into orange were not necessarily the things that were going to assist them to rise to the next level of consciousness, whereas they should have gone back to kind of inspect what should have been reformed, as Kevin pointed out.
So I just thought of this the other day. Like, Baptists have always been against transubstantiation.
Right.
Because,
which is magical. That's purple. That's magical thinking. Right.
If a blue Catholic says a prayer over the Eucharist and says, this is magically transformed to the body of Christ.
Right.
Or they say this has the real presence of Christ. That's a lie. If they're yellow and they say this has the real presence of Christ, it is true.
Right.
See
Exactly.
what I'm saying?
That's
yes.
right. Yeah.
Yes, I do. Yes.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yes.
So what the Baptists are fighting against is a blue truth claim.
Yeah.
That when the same propositions from a yellow perspective actually are true.
Yes.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
so but
Kevin, you can't see that. You can't see what you're saying unless you're at yellow.
Yeah.
There's no way you're going to be able to talk that wisdom into somebody who's still orange or blue.
Yeah. It's impossible to try to convey to somebody.
Right. Right.
Like how the same proposition coming from two different people can be false or true.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say something else about it, but that's...
And the grounds and the deliverables that come from that is the performative justification that comes from that is from living out the consciousness of the levels above. You can't know that from a proposition. You can only know it because it's like, oh, I get it. This is magical because it integrates all these other elements rather than just being kind of crudely magical.
So if someone from okay, let's go back to the chart just for a second. If someone from someone was in touch with ultimate reality and the true self, right? If they, in say 150 AD, they present a piece of bread and they're like, this is the real presence of Christ. And they're say they're yellow when they say that. I get that. But when you turn that into a blue dogma is when it becomes this thing that is separated from what was originally said and intended.
Mm-hmm.
But it goes,
yes,
when now it's a dualistic thing. Now we're saying that Christ is not elsewhere. You see what I'm saying?
I do. But the thing is that, like, so let's just take scripture, for example. Like, every proposition that's in scripture is true because it's true at every level of consciousness. Right? So no matter what level of consciousness you're observing it or reading it from, it's always true.
Right.
Where you are saying a characteristic of particular levels of consciousness is to think that it is only true within this level.
It's like exclusively true in a dualistic kind of way.
Right.
Something like that. So like a well-intended idea, like if you're like to eat the bread and drink the blood or drink the wine, if that is to remind you of the real presence of Christ that is everywhere and in all things, in him we live, move, breathe, and have our being, I can see how that practice can help with that idea.
Yeah.
When somebody propositionalizes it into an exclusive dogma, it becomes a completely different thing.
Yeah.
I love that we have animations now.
The proof of any proposition is in the pudding. It's big elephant theology. I mean, if the proposition is this, that God becomes, or the bread becomes God's body, let's say that's the proposition. And if you live your life in such a way that you think that that's a magical thing, that you've just magically ingested God's body and this is going to give you all kinds of superpowers, and that you should worship and adore it during some meditation hour, that performance of that proposition, you've got it wrong. And eventually, I contend that in a few months' time, in a few years' time, maybe in a few lifetimes' time, that proposition is going to bankrupt your life in one way or another. It's going to cause you to encounter some critical fail in your life, which is going to then make you question the proposition, and then maybe go back to it at another point and take it in another way. Let's say then you take
questioning the proposition. You're now in stage 4,
right?
Maybe cynical of it, and then when you come back to reintegrate it, that's
right.
where you're in stage 5. I'm trying to put it in stage terms.
Yeah,
for people to get some literacy in this.
So what you're doing is you keep working with the proposition until such a time as you realize its effectiveness. That was originally the wisdom that was originally embedded in that proposition, right? And if ultimately, if you can't justify it performatively at any level of consciousness, then you can call that proposition false, because clearly it doesn't work for you at any level of life, right? And that's what the whole process of human history for 6,000 years is just this: people and groups working out the justification of propositions. Sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, and then moving on to the next level. It's all just this huge test to find out which propositions are true or false through the performing of them in life and failing or succeeding with them.
I want to say a couple things about ego that I feel need to be clarified almost every time the concept of ego comes up. And it seems to kind of open people's eyes. And the 3 words that I try to get people to remember with ego, we're not talking about necessarily being arrogant and conceited when we say ego. We're talking about identity and attachment. That's what we're talking about. And if you could imagine that as a person, all the things that you identify with, maybe you're a Baptist, maybe you're a deacon, maybe you're a Republican, maybe you really like Chevys, or maybe you're a father, maybe you're a welder. You have all these different things. And then you have self, like how I perceive myself. And then you have self prime, which is how others perceive you. And you might have a lot of self primes, like how my sister perceives me is maybe very different than from how my mother perceives me. And I have a subconscious, you may not be conscious of all this, but I have a subconscious working of all my different self primes that are out there, that are like how my work sees me, how my family sees me, how my wife sees me, how the cat sees me. To transcend the ego is to recognize that these attachments are not you. When someone says, "Who are you?" You say, "Well, I'm a welder," and you're not any of those things. And so the breaking of those attachments is how we come forward. You might have an attachment to a particular view on a particular thing. So if somebody hears us talking about abortion, for example, people, when you start to feel yourself your heart beats a little faster and you go into fight or flight mode, you've got an identity attachment to something in that arena.
Right.
Which indicates to you, well, I need to figure out what that is and realize that is not my identity, and you know you've transcended the ego, at least in that degree, when that issue can come up and you don't feel yourself, your body reacting with those anxieties of fight or flight or something like that. And then it could go for any kind of issue, and whatever your pet doctrines are, eternal security or no reincarnation, whatever the things are, that's your identity. So I just want people to be thinking of those attachments. And I'm going to be doing a video later where I'm talking about cluster B personality disorders and how those attachments for people, so you can actually interpret cluster B personality disorders in terms of ego. And so those spider web attachments for people are both more fragile and more heavily relied on, which means on the threat front, they are getting a lot more false positives than regular people, if that makes sense. And so that's what keeps them all keyed up all the time, and why you have to walk on eggshells around them, because there's that constant over reliance and that constant fragility. And that's so any one of those things gets threatened, they feel like their identity is about to die. Whereas some of us, if something gets threatened, well, I guess I'm no longer a welder, we can deal with it a little better. They can't. Anyway, so everything can be looked at in terms of ego, and you can point it to any situation and assess it and bring ego literacy into the situation.
So, you said something interesting there about that, is when you're in conversation or when you're even engaging with somebody who it becomes obvious and apparent to you that they have some kind of attachment. I find that I struggle with this a lot. Is I feel like I tend to focus and start to filter what I'm trying to say in order to spare that person's ego being exposed or getting triggered or being contended with in some way.
Try to avoid the fight or flight mode so you can still
that I can still keep talking with them. Yes.
The functional communication breaks down when they feel that threat.
So I feel like I'm able to speak more freely, openly, fluidly, and articulately when I'm with a group of people or with a person who the trust is built with that person, where I'm not going to offend them. I'm not going to reveal something to them that's maybe not my place to reveal that. You know what I'm saying? So there's a level of trust there that needs to be built, or a level of rapport and communication ethic that needs to be established in order for the fluency of communication and thought transmission to be there. And I feel like I struggle with that a lot, being able to still effectively communicate with somebody who I'm spending way too much mental horsepower on
not breaching one of those vectors.
Yes. I feel like I spend too much time doing that. And it also, it's funny because it has a really reciprocal effect or a spiraling effect, where once I start to consider those things, it blocks me off from being able to consider something that may actually be helpful, So
I think there's a good way to get some really easy discernment on theosis and the two different ways of viewing the ego. So if you find yourself saying I'm God, but you're not, you're probably wrong, because anybody who says I'm God Almighty and the rest of you all are not is in delusion.
Right.
But if you find yourself seeing God in others and having lived and served that in others, Christ spoke of, the best testament of theosis in the New Testament is Matthew 25, the Great Judgment. We didn't know we saw you, Lord, right? Well, you saw me in the least of these. The ability to see Christ in others activates something in us that makes you realize eventually, usually at second tier consciousness, that it was God in you responding to the suffering of others.
Mm-hmm.
But this takes procedural knowing. If I told you as a proposition, even if it was a proposition from Matthew 25, saying, oh, the best way to recognize that others are God is to, to just make this proposition and believe Matthew 25, that wouldn't work. But if you lived a life of service in which you, year after year, continually served others, visited people in prison, fed the hungry, administered to the sick, where you got to a point where you couldn't look at anybody without seeing Christ in them. And then you came to a realization through those procedures that, wow, all this time I've been recognizing Christ in others. That's been Christ in me doing it.
Yeah.
I couldn't have done it. I couldn't have done that as an ego. The only way I could have recognized God in others is by God moving in me, which makes me God. Not because I'm God Almighty separate from everybody else and you're not, but because you are God, and that's how I realized I'm God. That's what theosis is in a proper understanding.
So Donald Hoffman came to this same awareness through science. At the end of the conversation, I've been a fan of Donald Hoffman for several years now. I ate up all his videos. I read
me too.
all this kind of stuff. Love him. And so when he was talking to Jordan Peterson recently, the question came up like, who are you? What are you? Something like that. And Donald Hoffman was like, I am that one underlying fundamental consciousness, and expressed as this thing that shows up as Donald Hoffman, and you are too, Jordan Peterson. It's like you recognize that the same electricity is running all the appliances. It's
Right.
It's the same thing. It's the same wind air that's coming through all of our vocal cords, and it's the impedance of that air in a certain way that gives it a uniqueness, but it's the same air. In the same manner, it's the same consciousness. This is the light which lighteth every man that cometh into the world, that's flowing through each individual, and you get to the point where you recognize that is.
But the only way to wake up to that in an authentic and not egoistic, delusional way is through serving others. You cannot know your own divinity until you realize the divinity of others. That's the only activation mode for that.
Interesting.
I'm trying to like
imagine that.
Yeah, I'm trying to like play that out in my head.
Well, that's why God has made others. I mean, that's why God manifested God's self through 8 billion people, because if it was just a one-on-one relationship with an invisible God, like what good would that be? It's that we've been given others to love so that we could love those who need our love. God doesn't need our love. God is absolute total creation and bestowal. He could care less whether we love him or not, because he only loves us, and that love goes in one direction. But God wanted us to feel what it means to love others, to be a bestower. So he created us first just as receivers, just as takers, but eventually he created us as takers who would eventually evolve to a point where we would understand we could be bestowers and creators like him. But we couldn't be a bestower and a creator to him because he's already a creator. He doesn't need anything. So he created others to give to, so that we would feel the blessing of what it means to be a bestower and a creator. That's what it means to be a child of God, to be able to feel what it means to be a creator and a bestower like the Father.
I'm thinking of 1 Corinthians 13 here in with charity, that charity like vaunteth not itself, like it's not puffed up, it's not unseemly, doesn't seek its own, like it's like this unrelenting laser focus on everything and the needs of everything else. But in order for charity to actualize, I think the word you used was actuate, was to actualize itself, is to be what it is.
Right.
So it goes out, and only in the act of going out, agape, will it ever be actualized in itself. I don't know how to say that without making it seem like it gets a perspective on itself. You know what I'm saying?
But that's what it does. I think that's what it does.
In the dramatic view of the unit, yeah. It's when each one of us is wearing a persona, and when we finally turn back and realize that we are the one sleeping in the dream, that's the moment that that one
Well,
wakes
this
up.
was the model that the fathers tried to talk of when they spoke of perichoresis and the Trinity. They didn't mean all these crazy, quasi-magical things that people think of when they think of the Trinity. All they meant was love can only be activated among persons through each other. There's no way a single monotheistic block called God, the way some Muslims conceive it as just this Allah who's up there. Allah can't love himself. The only way that God's love can be actuated is by God loving God through God, which is kind of the image of perichoresis that was later turned into this magical image of the Trinity. By first tier consciousness. First tier consciousness can't conceive of this perichoresis, and so it turns it into a magical item called Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. But Father, Son, and Holy Ghost is just kind of a fairy tale. What perichoresis or Trinity really means is God loving God through God.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like a flow and a movement to it. So that
That's
for those
exactly
in the
right.
audience, what Seraphim is saying is perichoresis, and choresis is like choreography. Circle. It's a circle dance. So there's a movement to it. If you could imagine like a yin yang that has three parts instead of two, and it's constantly in motion, chasing itself, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
It's like
that's what
Father
we're all here
loving
to do
Son.
for each other.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like Father loving Son through Spirit. That's you just play with the words a little bit.
Or there are any number of triads that you can even observe in nature. Nothing in nature serves itself. Everything in nature is just done to contribute to the ecological cycle of the whole.
Or like, what is the ego of your cells in your body? They are all self-sacrificing to the whole without question.
Mm.
When I lived in Kentucky, I just want to convey this real quick. And I lived in Kentucky from 2005 to 2008 with 15 months of that spent in Iraq. But for the first part before we went to Iraq, I was responsible with connecting everybody, getting the whole battalion set up. We had to stand up the battalion and then deploy immediately because we started a unit that didn't previously exist or was resurrected from like World War II. And as I was talking to the G6 on post to get some of our stuff, there was a guy in there named Robert. He was a older, tall, black guy, probably in his mid-50s, had like big hair. And he was very calm, very kind, very gentle. And somehow we wound up having religious discussions. And he had been all the way through all the degrees of masonry and all the way through Egyptology and everything else. And I remember very specifically one time he said, "When I look at you, I see me." And like he's being all calm and I'm arguing all this Christian doctrine to try to tell him how wrong he is and how he needs to get saved and get Jesus and all this. And he was saying all these things that didn't make any sense to me. And I wish I could go back and talk to him again because now I haven't been through masonry or Egyptology or anything else, but the perspective that he had is now a perspective that I have. And it's not like he converted me or anything. I just have a memory of encountering somebody like that. And, we over a few months, we had several conversations. And at the time, to me, it was antagonistic and rivalrous, and he needed Jesus. And I didn't realize the whole time I was the one that needed Jesus.
Pretty ironic.
Yeah.
I was very prideful, egoic. We've been going at this for 2.5 hours. We ready to take a break for a couple days? Got any final words? Any final thoughts you want to put out? We'll start with James, and then go to Nick and Seraphim.
Not really. Just appreciated the opportunity and thought this was a very constructive discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming, Nick.
Yeah, I'm kind of fried a little bit, so I can't wait to watch it again and see all the little nuggets that came out of that one. It was good. That was fun. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Ditto. I appreciate you coming. And Seraphim?
Yeah, I would just say for anybody who's befuddled or confused about what second tier consciousness is, spiral of consciousness, all this stuff. It can all be boiled down into one thing, and that's the new commandment that the Lord gave us, that you love one another. That's it. That's how you're going to get to second tier consciousness. That's how you're going to obviate the ego. That's how you're going to get theosis. That's how you're going to get saved. It's all boiled down to that one thing, Christ's new commandment. So that's the summary.
Yeah, Romans 13, love your neighbor as yourself. And Paul said the end of the commandment is this, charity.
Mm-hmm.
And Colossians 3:14, above all these things,
Put on charity.
put on charity, which is the bond of perfection, and faith, hope, and love is the greatest of these things. So that is I was about to say I couldn't add words to what you just said, but I just did. But I guess I'm just reinforcing that it is a very biblical thing, that love, charity, agape,
Altruism.
is the thing.
That's it.
Thank you, gentlemen. Look forward to doing this again with you soon. Appreciate your
Thank
time.
you. All right, bye.
See you guys.
Appreciate it.